1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 1. Our sermon today is entitled A Spiritual Church. And today, Newport Richie, I'm going to be inviting you to two things. Number one, I'm going to invite you into the spiritual realm. And number two, I'm going to invite you to the 10 days of prayer. That's what I want to do today in my sermon. And so 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 1, the Apostle Paul writing to the church of Corinth. I think you guys are a little familiar with the church of Corinth by now. The Apostle Paul says, brothers and sisters, brethren, I could not speak to you as spiritual, but as fleshly. Now, some of your translations, they maybe use the word carnal. Maybe some translations use the word unspiritual, but literally in the Greek, the word is fleshly. The Apostle Paul, he wants to address the church at Corinth. He wants to address them as spiritual, but he can't because they are not spiritual. They are fleshly. And again, I've mentioned in some translation it uses the word carnal. Now, while carnal, while it can refer to the base human passions, that is the lower propensities, that is our appetite, our passion, our emotions, our instincts. Some neurologists, they call it the reptilian brain, is what they call it. Is it the limbic? I think it's the limbic part of our brain that controls, again, our emotions, our instincts, these kinds of things. While our carnality and that word carnal can refer to these things, that word also has a broader connotation, and that is simply the material, that is the human, that is the earthly, that is the physical. In other words, the Apostle Paul wants to speak to them as spiritual, but he cannot because he says you're still fleshly, you're still carnal, you are still focused on the material, you are still focused on the human, you're focused on the earthly, you're focused on the physical. In fact, a few verses before 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 1, the Apostle Paul uses this same description in a comparison. Now go to chapter 2, 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 12. And the Apostle Paul here says, now we, in contrast to the fleshly, in contrast to the carnal, in contrast to the earthly, he says, now we have received the Spirit. In the Greek, that is the pneuma. You'll see the word here in a little bit. We have received the Spirit. We have received the pneuma, who is from God. And as we receive the pneuma, as we receive the Spirit that is from God, that enables us to know the things that have been freely given to us by God. Newport Richie, did you catch that? As we receive the Spirit of God, we are then able to know the things of God, the things that God has been freely given to us. And there's that word there for the Spirit. And the Apostle Paul will characterize those who have received the Spirit with this word, pneumatikos. Can you guys say that? Pneumatikos. It probably sounds like pneumonia, right? Or pneumatic. That's kind of the same. The wind of God, the breath of God, the Spirit is that breath of God. And the Apostle Paul calls those who have received the Spirit of God and can understand the things of God, he calls them in this passage, 1 Corinthians 2 and verse 12 and 13, he calls them the pneumatikos, that is literally the spiritual ones. But then in contrast, in verse 14, 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 14, he then describes another group. Not the pneumatikas, but another group. He says, but the natural man does not receive the things of the Spirit of God. Did you catch that? Verse 12, we have received the Spirit of God, but now there's another group in verse 14 that has not received the Spirit of God. The natural man, and we're going to look at that word here in a little bit, the natural man, the natural person does not receive the things of the Spirit of God. In fact, verse 14 says, because they are foolishness to them. The natural man, the natural person considers the things of God foolish. He cannot understand the things of God because they are only discerned through the Spirit of God. It's a contrast to verse 12. Again, I'm going to repeat myself. The pneumatikos, the ones who receive the Spirit of God, can understand the things of God. Verse 14, the natural man does not receive the Spirit, and as a result, they cannot receive or understand the things of God because they are spiritually discerned. The natural man, this is the word that the Apostle Paul uses to describe this natural person, the physikos. Can you guys say that word there in the Greek? The physikos. Does that sound like a word you guys know? Physics, maybe. Physical. The physical ones. And so in this passage, we have a contrast between two individuals. The pneumatikos, the spiritual ones, again, who receive the Spirit of God and can understand the things of God. But then you have the physikos, you have the physical ones who do not receive the Spirit of God, do not understand the things of God because they are foolishness to them, and they can only be understood because they are spiritually discerned. The Apostle Paul is calling the church at Corinth to be of the spiritual ones. Now, if you notice, I put the word "or" in between there. Pneumatikos or physikos. I put the word "or" because there's nothing wrong with the physikos. There's nothing wrong with being in the physical world, in the earthly world, in the world. We are material beings. We are carnal beings. We are flesh and bones. This is the world that we inhabit. It is physikos. It is physical. But the problem with the physical ones, what's wrong is that they refuse to receive the pneumatikos. The physicos, they are only living in the realm of the worldly. They are only living in the world of the earthly, of what they can see. But God is calling them, the Apostle Paul is inviting them to a higher plane, to another realm, and that is the realm of the Spirit, where the Spirit of God is. And so what's wrong with them is not that they're in the physical, but what's wrong is they refuse to receive the Spirit of God. So that in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 1, the Apostle Paul telling the church in Corinth, I want to speak to you as pneumatikos, but I can't because you're physikos. Can you imagine a church whose members are largely inhabiting the world and the earth and the physical realm, and they are rejecting the spiritual realm? Can you imagine a church like that? As I was reading this, I was also thinking about, it's interesting because we speak of secularism today, we speak of materialism today, but it's nothing new. It existed in the days of Paul. In the days of Paul, there were those that were only concerned with what they could see with the material world. It's nothing new as it is today. And Paul is calling us, he's giving us an invitation into the realm of the Spirit of God, characterized in verse 12. Let's go here, 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 12. Characterized, verse 13, and this is what I read for the prayer. Verse 13, this is what we speak, not in words taught us by human wisdom, but in words that are taught by the Spirit. And so, again, those who are inhabiting the pneumatikos, those who are inhabiting the realm of the Spirit, they are characterized by receiving the Spirit of God. Verse 13, they are being characterized by being taught by the Spirit of God and being able to express the things of the Spirit in spiritual words and in spiritual language. A Christian theologian put it this way: those who live in the Spirit, the pneumatikos, those who have received the Spirit of God, those who are understanding of the things of God, those who are being taught of the Spirit of God, he says that they are living, the pneumatikos, that they are living in a power that is, strictly speaking, beyond us, the spiritual ones. They are living in a power that is, strictly speaking, beyond us, that it is deriving from the spiritual realm itself. What do you think about that passage? They are living in a power that is deriving itself from the spiritual realm. Now, if that sounds too mystical for you, or you're unsure about that, if this is making you uncomfortable, these words, these expressions, the spiritual realm, Notice what Ellen White says in an article that she wrote in the book, or in the magazine Review and Herald. Notice what she says. These are the words of Ellen White. She says, we are constantly receiving, there's that word again, right? Verse 12, what is 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 12 says, right? But we have received the Spirit of God. She says, we are constantly receiving of God's bounty. All heaven, this is the spiritual realm, all heaven is astir, and they are dispatching messengers to all parts of the earth. Those are the angels. This is the spiritual realm that is all astir. And she says they are dispatching messengers to carry forward the work of redemption, and so that we are then members of his mystical body. He, Jesus, is the head, controlling all the members of the body. Jesus himself, in his infinite mercy, is working on human hearts, effecting spiritual transformation. He's working in the human hearts, in the physicus. He's working among our physical, in our physical body, in our physical mind. He's working a supernatural, a spiritual work in our hearts that leads to spiritual transformations so amazing that angels, again, the spiritual realm, they look on with astonishment and with joy. Amen. I was speaking to a colleague of mine, and she was telling me, and this is kind of where this is coming from, the sermon, and I've been working on this for months, and there's actually more to it, but this is just a little bit, and I've been processing this, and she said, Jonathan, we have far too low a conception of spiritual realities, is what she told me. We have far too low a conception of spiritual realities, and we locate way too much of our faith and our experience. We locate way too much of our faith in our own wills. That is, we try to do everything we can to demystify our faith. That is, I am the one who came to Jesus, our will. I am the one who came to Jesus. I'm the one who made the decision to be baptized. I am the one who left the world. I am the one who stopped drinking and stopped smoking and stopped doing these things. Or I made the decision to start doing these things. She says, we place too low a conception of spiritual realities, and we locate way too much of our faith in our own wills, in our own ideas, and in our own reason. And so I learned about the truth of the seventh-day Sabbath, and it makes sense to me. It's sensible. And so I made the decision in my mind to start coming to church on Sabbath. I see the historical development, our ideas and our reason. I see the historical development of the prophecies, and I see how it makes sense, and I can trace the timeline. And so then therefore, because it makes sense to me, I then decided to start coming to church. I see the archaeological evidence, and I see other evidence, and so this faith seems reasonable, and because it seems reasonable, I now am going to become a member of the church, and then our faith becomes a reasonable faith. Now, faith is reasonable. Don't get me wrong. Faith is reasonable. In fact, the Apostle Paul says it here in 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 6. He says, we have a message of wisdom. Our message is there is reason. It's not like it's not a dichotomy between it. But you know what is also reasonable? Secularism is also fairly reasonable. And evolution is also fairly reasonable. And materialism and humanism and all these other isms out there, they are also fairly reasonable. If you will sit down and listen to the arguments of those who have no faith, it's fairly reasonable as well. So if our faith is reasonable, and those who don't believe in God, their arguments are reasonable, then what tips the scale? The Spirit of God. And that's why the Apostle Paul says here in 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 5, he says, in fact, if we want to read from verse 4, he says, and so I came to you in my message, my word, and my preaching. They were not with wise and persuasive words, but my preaching to you was in demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom. And I know we look at that word and we think, well, he's talking about Greek philosophy and all. No. He's just talking about just our mind and how we process things and what we find reasonable and what we don't find reasonable and how we decide to do things and not decide to do things. The Apostle Paul says, I don't want your faith to rest on what sounds reasonable or maybe even evidence because it sounds, no. I want your faith to rest where? God's power. The pneumatikas, the spiritual ones, they have an experience where their faith rests on the Spirit of God, on God's power. And so I'm making an invitation to you today, Newport Richie. I'm making an appeal to you to accept that invitation to enter into the spiritual realm. I had a professor, tons of professors, and I don't even remember all the classes that I've taken, undergrad and seminary and with my doctorate. I don't even remember all the classes that I've taken. I don't really remember all the professors that I've had. I don't remember anything or much of what every single one has said. But there is every once in a while a professor that says something that just stands out. So for realistic expectations, I don't expect you to remember everything that I say in my sermons, but hopefully at least there's one thing that I say that is maybe life-changing, life-transforming. And so I had a professor at seminary. He passed away already, Dr. John Dibdahl. And he shared something in a class that was transformational in my experience, and I want to share it with you this morning. Dr. Dibdahl was speaking to us of the realm of the Spirit, and he described it this way. He showed us this chart, and he titled this chart, The Forgotten Middle. And what he's talking about is that pink area that you see there, that row that says spiritual. He says that is the forgotten middle. And he asks us, what is the function of the middle? When you look at the middle, that is the spiritual, angels and spirits and prayer and prophets and Bible and dreams and visions and miracles under the column of a personal experience versus the spiritual realm characterized by an impersonal characteristics such as astrology or magic. It's interesting that he included the Urim and the Thummim. Are you familiar with that? An impersonal way that God used to communicate with the priests back in the days. 2 stones that the high priest would wear on his breastplate, and when they would inquire of God, one would light up, and then the other one would go dim, and that's how they kind of would make decisions whether they should do this or do not. I think if the right one lighted up, yes. If the left one lighted up, it was a no. Martial arts, Eastern mysticism, meditation. He puts this into that spiritual realm, the personal and the impersonal. And he says, what is the function of the middle? And of course, on the top, you have the divine. You have God and Allah. And not that we believe in Allah, but he's trying to describe worldviews here of the divine, the personal, the impersonal. There are individuals who believe in the laws of the universe in some type of force. And then on the bottom, you have the material world, which is the physicus. This is where we live, and we try to understand life through psychology and sociology and anthropology, theology. It's where the arts come in and entertainment. On the impersonal side, the sciences of math and engineering, economics and technology. So he says, what is the function of that middle? What role does that middle plane play? That middle plane functions, he says, as the intermediator, as the bridge, as the connector between the divine and the earthly, between the divine and the human and this realm that we inhabit. That middle is that bridge, that connection. And he says that there's 5 main worldviews in the world today. There are the atheists, the agnostics, there are the secularists, and they live solely on that bottom level. Do you see it, the material? For them, it's all about what we can see, what we can touch, what we can taste. There is nothing more, there is nothing beyond what we can, prove and examine through science. The atheists and the agnostics, they live in the bottom level. He says there's another worldview out there, though, and that is the deist with a D. They believe in the top, and they also believe in the bottom, but they don't believe in the middle, the forgotten middle. A deist, that was something that was popular back in the days of the Enlightenment when they were coming out of the Middle Ages. And in the Middle Ages, everything was about the church and everything was about God. And if there was an explanation that you didn't understand why something happened, they would just say, well, because that's how God wanted it to be. Why does the sun go up and the sun go down? Because that's how God wants it to be. It's the God of the gaps. And as the deists were coming out of that and they were discovering the Enlightenment and they were discovering science, they started realizing that, no, wait a minute, the material, they started accessing the material world and they started understanding science and engineering and physics, and they started realizing, wait a minute, God is not the one responsible per se, directly responsible for everything in this world. There are laws of science and of math that is controlling things, and so deism came out of that. William Miller was a deist for many years. He believed in God, but that God didn't really have anything to do with the material world, didn't really come into our world. If there is a God, there was no way of knowing him. Deist. A third worldview, the magical and the mechanical worldview. Dr. Dibdall says that they inhabit the right side of the chart, that is the impersonal column, where they understand there's math, there's engineering, but we know that there's something more out there, but we don't really know what it is. It's these individuals who are fascinated by Eastern mysticism, and while they're down on Christianity, they're open to other forms of spirituality, and they sense that, again, there's some cosmic laws in the universe, there's some force that is working in the middle of us and in the midst of us. Number 4, then he says there is a medieval worldview. The medieval worldview inhabits the top of the divine, and it inhabits the middle, which is the spiritual, but it doesn't really get into the material. What does that look like? Well, someone is sick, and so they say, Pastor, pray for me. And so we pray for them, and then we say, are you going to go see the doctor? No, I don't need to see the doctor because you prayed for me, and that's good enough. That's that medieval mindset. It's still alive. I think I see some of you responding, it's still alive today. It hasn't died away. The medieval also looks like the Catholic Church condemning the study of science and Galileo, because what Galileo was studying was outside of their understanding, so we have to condemn the science and we have to condemn the scientists. It's still alive today. And Dr. Dibdall says, no, there is a fifth worldview, and that fifth worldview is Christian theist, not deist with a D, theist with a TH. That is, we understand this chart in balance, the material, the spiritual, and the divine. And he says, and he gave a critique here, he says there are 2 problems that the Seventh-day Adventist Church is facing today. And he says there are 2 main worldviews in our church, in our global church, that are battling between each other. The first problem that we have is the worldview that we find in the church in the global north, that is Europe, North America, and Australia. And that is the worldview of atheism, and especially deism, he says. And again, a critique of the church in North America, a critique of the church of higher education. Dr. Dibdall says that educated Seventh-day Adventists are really closet deists. Did you catch that? Educated Seventh-day Adventists are really closet deists. They have little evidence of God working in their life. Yes, they pray. Yes, they read their Bibles, but they don't really expect anything to happen as a result of praying. Yes, they attend church every Sabbath, but they don't really expect anything more. They are inhabiting in the divine realm, but in the material realm as well, but there's really no use for that middle, that forgotten middle. In fact, he goes on and he describes them as these Seventh-day Adventists in the global north. They are happy because they have a church community. They're happy. They're healthy because science and our health message, right? Blue zones, right? So they're happy and they're healthy and they're wealthy, because of education has enabled to place them in a financially secure place. He says Seventh-day Adventist higher education is currently producing happy, healthy, and wealthy deists. The worldview of higher education, he says, is largely deistic and atheistic. And who is Dr. John Dibdahl? He was president for one of our Adventist universities. He was the chair of one of our departments of theology. Dr. Dibdahl lived in the academic realm. He says Seventh-day Adventist higher education is largely influenced by deistic and atheistic worldviews. You go to the university, he says, and the longer you're at the university, the less likely you are to believe in the supernatural, the less likely you are to believe in that middle ground. If you're educated long enough in the global north, belief in God's power, belief in the supernatural, belief in the spiritual will be trained out of you because of secularism being the dominant worldview. But he says the spiritual life, that spiritual life is central to the Christian experience because we have to make contact with the God who is active in this world. Charismatics, he said, and not that this is an endorsement of the charismatic movement, but he says charismatics are the largest growing faith group in the world, mainly because at their core is the belief that God's presence and power is alive in the world. That middle. And there is a renewal for spirituality, he says, and mysticism today. And he says, what that tells me is that people are hungering for God. They're hungering for an authentic experience of the spiritual realm. But if they're not experiencing him in the right way, they're going to experience him in the wrong way. Challenge number 1 to our church: happy, healthy, wealthy, Seventh-day Adventist deist. He said the second challenge that the second danger that the world church is facing, he says, is mainly found in the global south and among some who are more conservative. And he says they live in the magical world that is on the right side of the chart, that right column, the impersonal. They live in that magical world where there are the ABCs of prayer. Do you know what the ABCs of prayer are? Ask, belief, and claim. If you follow this formula, if you follow this potion, if you get the right person to pray for you, the anointed person to touch you, and no one else, that there's a certain herb that if you find, and if you use that in this occasion, it will work, that there's a certain protocol that if you follow, it'll work. If you do this and this and this, then God will bless you. Now, if you become a baptized Seventh-day Adventist member, everything will work out just fine for you. If you pay your tithe, and if you become a vegetarian, and you go to church every Sabbath, everything will work out for you. And yet what happens is people who do that, they still get sick and they still die. And then people get angry and upset with God because he can't do that, because that's not my worldview. The Bible, and this is Dr. Dibdahl, the Bible, he says, is full of that middle area. How much time does this Bible spend with exorcism? How much time does the Bible spend with healing, Newport Richie? How much time does this Bible spend on visions and on dreams and on miracles and the Holy Spirit? How much time do we spend in that middle area? In fact, John Dibdahl says we've actually have put up guards to protect us from the middle area. What he means by that is when we're making this transition between the realms, out of that middle area, we have picked prayer and we have picked the Bible as the only thing in the middle area that is safe. We guard and we insulate ourselves against everything else in the middle. So Abraham didn't have a Bible, Newport Richie. Was Abraham still able to have communion with God? It is possible to have communion with God, very real communion with God, without the Bible. I shared with you that for the first 25 years of the New Testament church, there was no New Testament. And yet the church was still growing, and yet the church was prospering. How does the church prosper without any written instruction, Newport Richie? You know what it says in the book of Acts? Over and over and over again. Before there was a written word, the book of Acts says, and the Spirit of God. And the Spirit of God spoke, and the Spirit of God led, and the Spirit of God was present, and the Spirit of God was there. Are you willing to come into the spiritual realm, Newport Richie? John Mark Comer, in his book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, he writes that the average smartphone user, they touch their phone 2,617 times a day. And I was looking for a source for that. I didn't believe him. I thought he was just another pastor making stuff up, pastors making up stuff. Sure enough, 2,617 times a day. And he gives the challenge, what would our life be like if God touched our minds as frequently as we touch our phones? Newport Richie, I want to invite you into the realm of the Spirit for 2025. There's a lot happening this year. We're talking about doing an evangelistic series later this year with Pentecost 2025. I mentioned that last year. There's a lot that's going to be happening, and I want us to be in tune with God. I want us to be in tune with what He's doing. If you remember that Ellen White quote, all heaven, the messengers that are out there astir, they're working in this world. I want us to be in tune with what God is already doing. And so I don't know any other way to do it but then to start with prayer. I don't have all the details of this, and this is something that the World Church did a few weeks ago. We weren't ready to do it, but I don't think it's too late to do it. Is it too late to do it? I don't think it's too late. So I don't have all the details yet, but starting this Thursday, I want to invite you to begin 10 days of prayer, January 23, 10 days of prayer here. I will lead out. We're going to pray. It's going to be a time to learn how to pray. I think it's going to be 1 hour. I'll be leading out in this. There's going to be readings. There's going to be things that we want to pray for. But I want to invite you into the realm of the Spirit. And as I invite you into the realm of the Spirit, I think this may be a good starting point. 10 days of prayer. Is that okay, Newport Richie? I'll give you the exact time. I don't know yet. I'm thinking 6:37. I'm thinking, should we have food? I don't know. I'm still working out those details. But I know we're going to start this Thursday here at the church for 10 days of prayer. And I want to invite you to come to that.